there is a weather app on your phone claiming a 20% chance of rain, and you are personally offended by this. That's the size of disaster we deal with today. A wrong forecast, a ruined picnic, maybe a canceled flight if the universe really wants to test you in 74. Years ago, the weather did not ruin anyone's picnic. It tried to end the species. Not a war, not a predator, not a disease with a name and a mechanism you could at least point to and say, that's what got us. Just a mountain. A very large, very unimpressed mountain, currently located under a lake in Indonesia, that had spent about 75,000 years quietly building up pressure like it had somewhere better to be. And then, one day, it let all of it out at once. This is the story of the Toba eruption, and the theory that it's the single closest call the human species has ever had, possibly ever will have. And if the theory is right, we didn't survive it because we were smart or strong or adapted. We survived it out of what looks a lot like dumb luck. Here's the scale, because Supervolcano gets thrown around a lot and usually doesn't earn it. Toba did. Geologists rank eruptions on something called the Volcanic Explosivity Index, an 8-point scale, where each number is roughly 10 times bigger than the one before it. Most eruptions you've heard of in your lifetime, Mount St. Helens, Ijafjallajökull, the one that grounded half of Europe's flights in 2010, sit around a 4 or a 5. Toba hit an 8. The maximums, the eruption ejected somewhere in the range of 2,800 cubic kilometers of material. For comparison, that's enough to bury the entire state of California under more than a meter of ash in a single event in a matter of days. And ash was the least of it. The real damage came from what the eruption did to the sky. Toba threw so much sulfur and fine particulate matter into the upper atmosphere that it blocked out sunlight across huge stretches of the planet for years. Some estimates put global temperatures dropping by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius in the aftermath. Enough to trigger what scientists call a volcanic winter. Not a cold season, a cold era. Forests that had taken thousands of years to establish began dying off. Grasslands that herds depended on turned to dust, and the humans who depended on those herds were suddenly living through a famine with no clear end date, caused by a rock that erupted on the other side of the world for most of them. This is where the theory that made Toba famous comes in, and it comes from an unlikely place: your own DNA. In the late 1990s, an anthropologist named Stanley Ambrose noticed something strange while studying human genetic diversity. Compared to almost every other species on Earth, humans are remarkably similar to each other genetically, far more similar than you'd expect from a species that's supposedly been around and spread out for hundreds of thousands of years. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, show more genetic variation within a single local population than humans show across the entire species, globally. Something at some point squeezed the human gene pool down to a tiny fraction of what it should have been. Ambrose's proposal was simple and brutal. Toba did it. His genetic bottleneck hypothesis suggested the eruption and the volcanic winter that followed crashed the entire global human population down to somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 breeding individuals. Not 1,000 in one region, possibly 1,000 on the entire planet. Every single person alive today, all 8 billion of us, would be descended from whoever made it through that bottleneck. If Ambrose is right, this wasn't a war we won, or a threat we outsmarted. It was survival by accident. The people who made it through weren't necessarily the strongest or the most clever. They were just wherever the ash didn't fall as thick, or near whichever water source didn't dry up first, or simply lucky enough to be far enough from the epicenter that very bad didn't tip into unsurvivable. For a species that likes to tell itself a story about adapting and overcoming, the honest version might be: we almost got wiped out by geology, and the main thing that saved us was location, location, location. But, and this is the part most versions of this story leave out, not everyone agrees Toba was actually the extinction-level event it's been sold as. And the evidence against it is just as interesting as the disaster itself. In the early 2000s, archaeologist Michael Petraglia and his team excavated a site called Jwalapuram in southern India, sitting almost directly downwind of Toba. If anywhere on Earth should show a clean break in human activity, tools before the eruption, nothing after, then a long gap before anyone shows up again, it should be here. Instead, they found stone tools in the layers directly above the volcanic ash, nearly identical in style to the tools found below it. Whoever was living there before Toba erupted was, by all appearances, still living there afterward, still making the same tools, seemingly without the civilization-ending gap the bottleneck theory would predict. Other researchers have pushed back on the genetic side too. More recent population genetics studies have questioned whether the bottleneck numbers were ever that extreme, or whether the low genetic diversity Ambrose noticed can be explained by other, less dramatic causes, like humanity's relatively recent expansion out of a small population in Africa to begin with, volcano or no volcano. So where does that leave the story? Probably somewhere in the middle, which is usually where the truth ends up living. Toba was, without question, one of the largest eruptions in the last 2 million years, and it absolutely triggered a period of serious global cooling. Whether it single-handedly reduced humanity to a few thousand people worldwide, or whether some regions barely noticed while others were devastated, is still genuinely being argued over by the people who study this for a living. What's not in dispute is this. For years, potentially the better part of a decade, a huge portion of the planet went cold, dark, and hungry because of one mountain, and whatever people were on the wrong side of that mountain paid for it. And maybe that's the part worth sitting with. We like our extinction stories to have a villain, a predator, a rival species, a virus with a name. Toba doesn't give you one. It's just weather, on a scale large enough to nearly erase everyone who's ever going to read this sentence. No one fought it off. No one outthought it. The people who survived because the ash column happened to drift somewhere else, or because their valley still had water when the next one over didn't. Every single advantage we've built since then, cities, medicine, the fact that you can check tomorrow's forecast on a phone instead of finding out the hard way, exists because a relatively small number of extremely lucky people didn't happen to be standing under the wrong cloud 74,000 years ago. Next time your weather app gets it wrong, that's genuinely the worst version of this story you will ever have to live through. Your ancestors were not so lucky. And if the bottleneck theory is right, a lot of them weren't lucky at all. You're only here because a small handful of them were.